Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we spend the rest of the hour going deep inside the processed food industrial complex, beginning with the extraordinary science of addictive junk food. That was the cover story in the recent New York Times Magazine that examined how food companies have known for decades that salt, sugar, and fat are not good for us in the quantities Americans consume them. And yet every year they convince most of us to ingest about twice the recommended amount of salt, 70 pounds of sugar, 22 teaspoons a day. Then there's the fat. Well, New York Times reporter Michael Moss explains how one of the most prevalent fat delivery methods is cheese.
Every year, the average American eats as much as 33 pounds of cheese. That's up to 60,000 calories and 3,100 grams of saturated fat. So why do we eat so much cheese? Mainly it's because the government is in cahoots with the processed food industry. And instead of responding in earnest to the health crisis, they've spent the past 30 years getting people to eat more. This is the story of how we ended up doing just that.
That was Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times investigative reporter Michael Moss. His new book is called Salt, Sugar, Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us. He goes deep inside the laboratories where food scientists calculate the bliss point of sugary drinks or the mouthfeel of fat and use advanced technology to make it irresistible and addictive. As a result of this $1 trillion a year industry, 1 in 3 adults and 1 in 5 kids is now clinically obese. In a bit, we'll look ever further into the process of making processed foods with Melanie Warner, author of Pandora's Lunchbox. But first, Michael Moss joins us here in the studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
You open your book with a remarkable summit. Talk about who was there.
This is a meeting in 1999 that engaged the CEOs of some of the largest food companies in the country. And they were presented with a vivid picture of the emerging obesity crisis. And what really amazed me about this meeting when I found out about it and found the records to it and talked to some of the people who were present is that it was none other than one of their own, a senior executive at Kraft, who basically laid the emerging obesity crisis at the feet of the processed food industry and pleaded with them to do something collectively to turn the corner.
What happened?
And coming from him, it was just so powerful. They reacted, as you can imagine, rather defensively. They said, look, we're already providing people with choices in the grocery store. We are committed to nutrition as we are to convenience and low prices. Frankly, they were worried about the lost millions in sales if healthier products they created weren't as attractive as the ones they do make.
Talk about the CEO who basically ended the meeting.
The head of General Mills made all of these points and was especially, I think, aghast at being blamed for the obesity crisis. Because, again, he felt that in the cereal aisle, for example, General Mills was providing Cheerios with low amounts of sugar, and he didn't see a need to down-formulate, if you will, all of the products in the grocery store in order to deal with this obesity crisis, which you have to remember back in '99 was not as grave as it is today.
And of course, the obesity crisis, I mean, in their terms, is about lawsuits, class action lawsuits. What does obesity mean? Why is this such a critical issue?
Well, yes and no. The Kraft official who raised this back in '99 was actually very deeply and sincerely concerned about the health effects on people and not so worried about litigation. What this did, though, mean to the companies, though, was what I write about in the book, which I have to tell you, Amy, was a bit of a detective story. I managed to come across a trove of internal documents that enabled me to get insiders to talk. And when they did, what it showed was that salt, sugar, fat are the 3 pillars, the holy grail, if you will, on which the food industry survives. And through their research, they know that when they hit the perfect amounts of each of those ingredients, they'll send us over the moon. Products will fly off the shelves, we'll eat more, we'll buy more. And being companies, of course, that they will make more money.
Name names and talk about examples of the weaponizing of salt, sugar, and fat.
One of the legendary senior scientists for the food industry, Howard Moskowitz, walked me through his creation recently of a new soda for Dr. Pepper, a new flavor line. And it was amazing how much effort went into that. You know, a regression analysis, high mathematics. He would take dozens and dozens of formulas just slightly altered to find what he calls the bliss point for sweetness in the sugar. And you can do this own experiment at home. Take a cup of coffee, keep adding sugar until you reach the point that you like it the most. And then when you add more sugar, you actually like it less. Well, the food industry knows that. And they spend huge amounts of effort finding the perfect spot, not just for sugar, but for fat and salt as well.
Frito-Lay head scientist Robert Isan Lee talks about people getting addicted to salt.
Yes. He was a wonderful, brilliant scientist who went to work for Frito-Lay in the late 70s when salt became an issue in Washington and the FDA started holding hearings looking at whether potentially it should regulate salt and not consider it inherently safe. Dr. Lin began pushing Frito-Lay to cut back on salt in its own products for economic reasons. He thought it would position the company really well. And he left Frito-Lay, and years later when I met him and we went through the documents that he saved from his days at Frito-Lay, it was just amazing to sit down with him at his dining room table and listen to his regrets at not having been able to have done more way back in the 70s and early 80s.
Talk about the tobacco industry's effect on the food industry.
I love this part of the story because it's really surprising. Philip Morris became the largest food manufacturer in the United States starting in the late 80s when it acquired General Foods and then Kraft. And as you can imagine, for the first decade of that ownership, it pushed the food managers to do everything they could to sell their products. But starting in the late 90s, when Philip Morris came under increasing pressure for nicotine and tobacco, and it was the first tobacco company to acknowledge, or rather to accept, the idea of government regulation, the Philip Morris officials turned to their food people and said, you guys, and this is private, of course, you guys are going to face the same issue we're facing over nicotine with salt, sugar, fat, and obesity. And they began nudging their food managers to start thinking about ways to ease back on their dependence on those three ingredients.
The problem with obesity, what it means for example, children.
You know, in my own household, I have two boys, 8 and 13, and you can just see the sugar craving that kids have inevitably for sugar. You know, we've tried to work with our grocery shopping to get control and I think that's one of the key things.
How do you do it with your kids?
Well, so with the kids, my wife Eve kind of arbitrarily said, hey guys, let's try to limit your cereal when we eat cereal in the morning to 5 grams or less of sugar. And we found that when you engage them in that, shopping becomes an Easter egg hunt, and they're able to go to the cereal aisle and find those cereals that meet that quota. And they may have to reach low, or I may have to reach high to find them, because the most sugary ones tend to be at eye level by calculation. But I think it's a really important issue, which you just can't throw fresh carrots and fresh apples at kids without engaging them. They'll chuck them out in the lunchroom. But if we could invigorate the home economics program in this country, which fell by the waysides, I think that would be a huge. Well, home economics. Kids in school used to be taught how to shop, how to cook from scratch, how to be in control of their diets. Doesn't happen anymore, and I write about this in the book. What did happen is we got Betty Crocker, a figment of the imagination of a marketing official at a food company. She began pushing processed foods, convenience foods, as an alternative to scratch cooking.
Explain more.
This was back in the 50s and 60s. Betty Crocker, as you all know, I used to think she was a real person. She wasn't. She started out just as a marketing tool for the companies, but she became emblematic of the food industry's assertion, if you will, of the home economists. And their notion was, hey, look, who's got time for scratch meals anymore? Let's encourage consumers to buy our convenience foods to make things easier for them.
Talk about Lunchables, how they were invented, what they mean.
I got to interview and see documents that were kept by Bob Drain, who worked for Oscar Mayer back in the 80s when the company faced a problem with its meat. People were cutting back on consumption of red meat because it has saturated fat and salt. And Mr. Drain and his team set about looking for a way to repackage those products. He was most interested in saving jobs, and he cared very much about the company. And they came up with the Lunchables, which, as you know, is basically a cold TV dinner aimed at kids for school lunches. But it has two remarkable things beyond kind of the ingredients that they used: meat, cheese, crackers, typically. First, they went after working moms who work outside of the home and designed it and marketed as a way for moms to get through the crush of the 7 a.m. crush in the household where everybody's scrambling to get out of the house and off to school and work. But then they went after the kids with an amazing marketing campaign, because they realized that the Lunchables wasn't about food. It was about empowerment for kids. And they came up with the slogan, all day you got to do what they say, but lunchtime is all yours. And kids went nuts for it. Pizza Lunchables, think about it. It's a piece of cold dough, cheese, tomato sauce that the kids assemble themselves, but that meant everything to kids, and sales skyrocketed.
And then they added dessert.
And then they added dessert, hamburger Lunchables, hot dog Lunchables, pancake Lunchables, some of them with huge loads of salt, sugar, fat. Kraft, to its credit, is now pulling back on those ingredients, and you can actually find some much lower amounts. But it opened the door to something really important, which is the fast food industry has moved into the grocery store. So you no longer have to go to a fast food chain to find problematic foods.
Michael Moss, talk about cheese. Talk more about cheese.
So I was amazed to hear that figure, that we are now on average eating as much as 33 pounds of cheese a year. And I thought, how could that be? And that's triple the amount back in the 70s. And the story goes like this. Starting in the 60s, people began drinking less whole milk as a way of reducing calories and intake of saturated fat. That left the dairy industry with a glut of whole milk and the milk fat they were extracting from the whole milk to make skim milk. They went to the government and asked for help, and they started making more cheese with that milk. The government, since it subsidizes the dairy industry, bought the cheese. It accumulated. It was storing the cheese in caves in Missouri when none other than Ronald Reagan came into office and says, "This is crazy. We've got $4 billion worth of cheese that's going moldy. Stop it." But they still wanted to support the industry, so they came up with a marketing scheme that allowed the dairy industry to collect tens of millions of dollars every year to encourage consumers, for advertising and marketing, to encourage consumers to eat more cheese. Not just as a delicacy that you eat as an hors d'oeuvre before dinner, but as an ingredient in processed food. And so suddenly cheese began showing up as slices on sandwiches, as ingredients in packaged foods in the store. And our consumption of saturated fat, while we thought we were taking it out of our diets, snuck back in, because cheese is largely invisible as a fat in that form.
Michael Moss, Jeffrey Dunn, whistleblower, or at least quit Coke. He was in charge of, what, $44 billion of sale of Coke.
Wasn't quite that much. He was in charge of North America, Latin America. But I'm glad you raised that, because
rather 20 billion.
Jeffrey Dunn was the top warrior at Coke, and he was the heir apparent, one of the heir apparents to the entire company. In 2000, when he began having a change of heart, and by the way, he walked me through all the incredible marketing strategy that Coke has, including targeting the most vulnerable consumers, which the company calls heavy users.
Don't call them consumers anymore. They're heavy users.
Heavy users. 20% of their customers drink 80% of the Coke, and those are the people that it's gone after. But starting in 2000, Jeffrey Dunn had a change of heart. It started with reading a book about sugar and the health effects. It went to his fiancée, who started like nudging him. "Hey, Jeffrey, do you really want to be doing this with your life?" And then he went to Brazil, where Coke was starting to market soda to the emerging middle class there. And out of the blue, Jeffrey says it was almost a voice he heard, said to him, Jeffrey, you know, these kids need a lot of things, but one thing they don't need is another Coke. He went back to the company, pushed them to work more on selling healthier drinks, including soda, and cut back on marketing to schools. He ultimately left the company, and today he is selling fresh carrots from a farm in California, but with this, and this is really important because this may be one way out of the situation that we're in. He's marketing carrots as junk food, meaning he's stolen a page of the playbook from the junk food industry to make carrots attractive to kids. And I think that is so brilliant.
We should probably clarify that he was pushing, when we say Coke, though it sounds like when you're talking about heavy users, Coke, cocaine, we're talking Coca Cola.
Absolutely. So.
And the problem with Coca Cola and what it means and why, for example, when they pushed it to Mexico at the time of a terrible recession, they upped their advertising because they thought, well, if anyone's got any money, they could put it into Coke.
And Coke will say, look, we're only part of the, in fact, recently they had an ad campaign saying, hey, we're only part of the obesity crisis. You can't blame everything on us as calories as calories. But there is something interesting with liquids. Science is starting to show that our brains are less able to detect calories in liquids. So people in the know, including food industry executives, when they run into health trouble, the first thing they do is cut calories out of all the liquids that they drink as a way of maintaining their weight.
What were you most shocked by?
Well, it was one was that, how on a personal level, how so many executives I met don't eat their own foods. The other thing I think that really shocked me was when I get to salt in the book, which is how dependent and how hooked the food companies are on salt, because it's a miracle ingredient for them. It lets them avoid using more costly ingredients like spices and herbs. It, of course, has this thing they call flavor burst, which just gets you so excited about eating snack foods especially. But the other thing is salt masks off notes or bad flavors that are inherent to some processed foods. In meat, it's called warmed over flavor, which happens when the fat in meat oxidizes when it reheats, and salt is one of those things that can cover up that taste. So I was really struck, and Kellogg invited me into the research and development department, made for me special versions of their icons like Cheez-Its, which I could normally eat all day long without any salt. It was the most god-awful experience you can imagine tasting those items. They are stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Michael Moss, I want to thank you for being with us. His book is called Salt, Sugar, Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us. His cover story in last Sunday's New York Times Magazine, The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Michael Moss is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. He won in 2010 for his investigation into the dangers of contaminated meat. But we're not leaving food. When we come back, we'll be joined by another New York Times reporter, Melanie Warner, who wrote Pandora's Lunchbox. You don't want to miss it, or maybe you do. It depends on what you're eating these days. Stay with us. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.